Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuen Campus in Hong Kong. Welcome back to the U.S. Presidential Election Series for 2024. As always, we're sharing tonight's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. And if you have any questions to submit, you can do so by first registering on Zoom and clicking on the questions and answer button. This is the third episode of our webinar series, and our faculty lead, Professor Robert Pape, will discuss disinformation and the domestic political implications to the U.S. presidential election with our two guest UChicago political science faculty this evening. Let me start with a brief introduction of our speakers. Robert Pape is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. His research focuses on international security affairs and political violence, and he's been our faculty lead for this series. Molly Offer-Westort is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Chicago. She's also affiliated with the Department of Statistics and the Committee on Data Science. She works on statistical methodology for social science research, which integrates machine learning methods with experimental design. And Ruth Bloch Rubin is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She studies the U.S. Congress, political parties, and the American political history. She's authored two books about legislative power dynamics, the first, Building the Bloc, and the second, Divided Parties, Strong Leaders. And she's also writing a third book, tentatively titled Legislative Rights, Congress, and the Making of American Indian Law. If you look at our event webpage, you'll find links to all of these books and publications on the registration page. Professors Pape, Offer-Westort, and Bloch Rubin are also on our podcast, The Course. I hope you can check out the interviews that we've had with them to learn more about each of these faculty members at UChicago and learn more about their career stories. Thank you again for joining us again tonight, Bob. I'll hand the stage over to you to get us started with our guests.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I want to say a big welcome to everybody who has joined us on the Zoom. It is really tremendous that we're able to have multiple sessions here and in some ways really get to engage with you. So as many of you know, our past sessions have discussed the implications for the election related to prospects for political violence and also related to geopolitics and international trade. Well, today we're going to turn a little more inward into America itself, and we're going to explore how voters will engage with disinformation and then what the implications of the election are for actual policy making in Washington. And to help us with this, we have two terrific scholars from our political science department at the University of Chicago, whose research is right at the leading edge of the underlying issues that we are talking about today. So Professor Molly Offer-Westort has terrific path-breaking studies of disinformation. And also Professor Ruth Bloch Rubin has terrific groundbreaking studies about policymaking, especially in Congress. And I can't think of two better people to help us understand these issues that, again, go right to what's happening inside of American politics. Now, to do this, we're going to do a little bit different order than we've done before. So our two professors are going to do a joint presentation. Professor Molly Offer-Westort is going to give her own presentation focusing on disinformation. And then Professor Ruth Bloch Rubin is going to give her own presentation focusing on the policy making in Washington, D.C. And then, as we have done before, we will have time for questions from you. And we want to invite you to start those questions. I'll be keeping tabs on the chat. And please feel free to, you have the wealth of expertise here to ask questions either directly about their presentations or just about the election itself. So with that, please let me turn it over to our two professors.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having us at this event to share our perspectives and our research in the context of this election, which is indeed a very exciting election. We have two very different candidates with very different visions for what America's future could look like. And so Professor Bloch, Rubin, and I will talk about the inputs and outputs of voters' choices for this coming election. So I'm going to talk about information and disinformation, how people process information, and particularly thinking about online information and online information environments. And then Professor Bloch Rubin will talk about how the election's outcome will shape politics in Congress, the executive branch, and the courts, and sort of the larger consequences for the American party system. So first, we wanted to say a little bit about how we're thinking about these two candidates. From my perspective as someone who studies social media and online spaces, these are two very interesting candidates with very different approaches to public relations. So Trump was the original Twitter president. He really leveraged the platform to speak directly to voters in his own voice, but not just to speak to voters. He also used Twitter to discipline federal bureaucrats, to conduct diplomacy, to issue orders, and to make policy. He now has his own social media platform, Truth Social, which he uses to communicate and connect directly with his base. So I think this is really interesting in that it first demonstrates how Trump uses social media to bypass existing institutions and communication channels. But I think it also kind of reflects this moment that we're in, where there's not a lot of daylight between our online and offline lives. Online spaces and social media are no longer a secondary space through which we're processing information about the real world. This is the real world where real political events are happening, and I think we should study it and consider it as such. Meanwhile, Harris has been supported by a social media machine, which already existed to back the Biden campaign, but really pivoted to a more kind of meme-forward format when Harris became the candidate. So this was they really benefited when British pop star Charlie XCX called Harris brat in the context of Brat Summer, which is just like this wildly internet moment. And they really kind of jumped on that and did an excellent job at turning that into memes, creating kind of viral content that they were very effective at engaging a young audience on video forward platforms like TikTok. So two very different models for reaching potential voters. Professor Bloch Rubin.
Yeah, so I think Molly has pointed to one of the reasons why this election is so exciting is that both of the presidential candidates have drawn so much of our attention online, on the airwaves. But it's easy to forget that actually there is also a bunch of congressional races that are up for grabs. And so as important as the presidential race will be, control of Congress is going to be at stake, and neither party is likely to win it all. I think we're quite likely, as I'll talk about later, to have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate or vice versa. And so the politics of that are enormously consequential for policymaking into the future. It's really hard to know who's going to win. Molly and I are going to talk about this. But one of the things that we can begin to get a sense of is how the Democratic and Republican parties are evolving. You know, what are they going to stand for? Who are their constituencies going to be? And one place we can look to start to understand that is to think about each candidate's vice presidential picks. So Tim Walz and J.D. Vance tell us a lot about where the parties are going. And so looking and trying to understand and contextualize those choices, in some ways those are the most consequential choices each candidate has made thus far in the election, tells us a lot about how they would govern.
So I'm going to talk a bit about my own research, which is on how people engage with information online, to kind of frame the information environments that we're all operating in the context of this current election. So social media and online spaces have really dramatically changed people's information environments. We talk about these ideas of echo chambers and filter bubbles, where the idea is that your online profile, which follows you around the internet, is a product of your Google searches, your social media connections, the Reels, Shorts, and TikToks that you watch, all of the online shopping that you do. All of this is put together into a profile of you, and different sites and platforms use this to kind of create an algorithmic filter to show you only the type of content that they think that you like to see. So we operate inside of these filtered bubbles or echo chambers in which we might only engage with people with like-minded views. Simultaneously, there's been this fragmentation of media with the advent of digital media. And so it's possible for us to only get news and information that is palatable to us based on our political perspectives. So as a consequence, we can be more alienated from those with different political perspectives. And this can drive, particularly in the US context, political polarization. So a lot of this is unintentional side effects of algorithms serving us what we like to see. But at the same time, this decentralization of information sources that's been facilitated by social media has meant that people can be targeted and led astray politically by bad actors. So an example of this is in the 2016 US presidential election. Around this time, there were troll farms originating in Russia that generated fake social media accounts claiming to be American voters with strong political perspectives that promoted disinformation. They created politically oriented Facebook groups and organized real political events in the US to which they recruited American social media users into. In the US 2020 election, there were also reports of Iranian political disinformation campaigns. So social media can create these opportunities for very convincing disinformation campaigns that are targeted to specific voter groups. And another challenge associated with this is even if people don't believe this disinformation or don't believe misinformation that they see online, just the fact of people being aware that there is misinformation and disinformation in their information environments contributes to information uncertainty. So this is basically the idea that people become less trusting of everything that they see, including information from reputable news sources. So they really just don't know what to believe. They know that there's misinformation out there, and so they're just generally more distrusting, and this can bleed over into the real world, which I'll talk about a little bit more, the electoral consequences of this in the US context. I do want to say that there is a political upside to social media as well. So it can create a platform for otherwise deplatformed voices. It can facilitate activism. It can advance voter organization, voter mobilization efforts. It can do a very good job of driving authentic political participation. In spring of 2011, in the Arab Spring, the decentralization of Twitter allowed people to organize in ways that they otherwise would not have been able to create an activist movement. This was the same thing with Black Lives Matter protests in the US in 2020. Online organization facilitated some of these movements. In the current Palestinian protest movements that are happening on US campuses now, a lot of that is facilitated through online organization. And the latter has very real consequences for this US election in that some supporters abstained from the presidential primary and may abstain or vote for third-party candidates for the election based on their positions related to this movement. Social media also facilitated things like the January 6th Capitol riot between the election and inauguration in this last election, where a lot of people came to a political event at the US Capitol, but had organized in advance on social media to participate in political violence. And so we worry that political actions driven by social media can first be based on bad information or can potentially lead to political violence. So there are some things that we can do about this. This is an area that I research. There are different outcomes that platforms, policymakers, and researchers might like to achieve to improve our online information environments. One, we would like people to see less misinformation and disinformation in the first place. Two, when people see this information, we want them to not believe it, not be convinced by it. And third, when they see this information, we want them to also not share it. And I'll talk about how believing it and sharing it are disconnected. These are different things that we might care about. So on this first point of seeing less misinformation and disinformation in the first place, there's been a very large collaborative research program with Facebook and a group of social scientists to look at the effect of tweaking algorithms to kind of roll back some of these effects of algorithmic filter bubbles to improve people's information environments and kind of social environments online. The first round of research has had some different results, but largely what we've seen is that these algorithmic tweaks are insufficient to change people's opinions, behavior and to counter polarization. And I think one way to think about this is that when we think about these algorithms that are serving us information, there's the algorithm that's taking inputs and deciding what information and what social media posts to serve you. But there's also a user who is giving information to that algorithm about what they like and what they engage with. And so thinking about the user as a decision maker in this process, I think is very important as well. So I have a research study with a researcher at the University of Chicago and at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where we looked at many different types of interventions aimed at curbing the spread of misinformation. This study was in Kenya and Nigeria because of the specific type of misinformation that we were targeting, which was information around COVID-19 and false cures that were being circulated and identified by a third-party fact-checking agency as problematic in this context. My colleague on this project, Leah Rosenzweig, is a scholar of African politics. But what I want to say is that I think a lot of the findings that we can see from these studies can be relevant across contexts. I've studied online information and engagement with information in the US, in Kenya, Nigeria, and in the Philippines. And I think that there are a lot of commonalities, even if the specific types of information might change across contexts. So we studied a bunch of different interventions aimed at curbing the spread of misinformation. And one of our key findings is that people share misinformation even when they know that it's false. So there are a lot of reasons that people might do this. They might not be very thoughtful as they're engaging online and they're just kind of scrolling through, and so they share posts. They might think that the misinformation post is funny or interesting, or their followers might engage with it. So even if they don't necessarily believe it's true, they think it might be an interesting conversation. Or they might think it's useful to share this misinformation so other people know that the information is out there as sort of a warning. So we don't know exactly what people's specific motivations are, but we do know that even when people know that something is misinformation, they still sometimes share it. So this is what we really targeted in our study, was to focus on this sharing behavior, because what we wanted to do was to change people's information environments more broadly. So if we think about these kind of viral social media posts, if we can change someone's sharing behavior, that can kind of cut off that virality of the post and decrease the amount of people who might see that social media post. So we looked at some different types of interventions. Here, the first one are flags and fact checks of posts. So you can see on the screen on the left, this this tweet of then President Trump about ballots. And there's a little exclamation point where Twitter says you can get the facts on this topic. So Twitter has tried some different approaches to this type of kind of flagging posts, where if a post mentions a topic at all, they'll have a flag with additional information on the topic. Sometimes posts that have been identified as potentially being misleading or misinformation have gotten these types of flags. And then I have on the right something that's from Facebook, where Facebook has used third-party fact checkers to identify social media posts that might be misinformation, news articles that might be misinformation, and also pages that might repeatedly share false information, where they have a flag that's associated with the post or the page, or they give related articles on the topic to give you more information on this type of issue. As far as I know, Facebook hasn't done this in the US, but they have done it in a number of other countries, where they party with a fact-checking organization who's able to do the fact-checking, and then they link to that. So what we found were that these types of interventions are not effective. And this is consistent with other research, in particular, these types of Twitter flags. There's been research in the US context that shows when people's political perspectives are aligned with that of the poster, particularly say for Republicans, if they see a poster who is a Republican and their post has this type of flag on it, people are actually more likely to believe the post if it has the flag than if it had not had the flag. So it's really ineffective in this way. And for other people, it's not effective at all. So you have this counterproductive effect of the intervention. So we find flags and fact-checking posts are not effective, but there are other types of interventions that we also looked at. We looked at trainings for users to spot misinformation. One of the most widely studied approaches to doing this is Facebook has these 10 tips for spotting misinformation that have been widely circulated and studied by other social scientists. And the idea of these tips are to get people to kind of train themselves to look more critically at posts. So they tell you to look at things like, look at the headline, look at the hyperlink, look at the photos, see if they might be doctored or if they might not be believable, to get people to be more capable at identifying what might be misinformation. This we found to be very effective. And there's another intervention that we also found to be effective, which is reminding users to be more attentive. And the idea here is that when people are scrolling on social media, they might not be very critically engaged with the social media posts that they're seeing, and they're just kind of scrolling through. And so they might not be very thoughtful as they're engaging with social media posts and sharing things or not, based on kind of just how they're immediately responding to it. And so the idea of the intervention is you ask people, hey, we have this social media post. Can you tell us whether or not this is true? And it doesn't actually matter whether or not the social media post is true and how people evaluate the post. The act of asking them to engage in that kind of critical behavior helps them turn their brains back on and be more attentive downstream. They're more able to identify misinformation from true information, and they're more discriminating in their sharing behavior. And I would say that this is really my goal when I think about these types of interventions, is we don't want people to stop engaging with information across the board. We don't want people to stop sharing posts on social media. We want people to keep engaging, but to be discriminating in their behavior and to be able to differentiate true things from false things and engage with the true things and keep on sharing those, but not engage with the false things, to create kind of a healthier information exchange and information environment. And for these two interventions, training people to spot misinformation and reminding users to be attentive, we actually found that they were effective for different types of people. So for the first one, training users to spot misinformation, these interventions were more effective for low digital literacy users. So people who maybe don't use the internet a lot, are not very tech savvy. For these people, these trainings were more effective. For people who were high digital literacy, so who use the internet a lot, were very technologically savvy, are online, know how to use their computer, for these users, reminding them to be attentive was more effective. And our kind of post hoc theory about this is that for low digital literacy users, they're actually gaining new information about how to spot misinformation from these trainings. For high digital literacy users, they may already know how to spot misinformation. What they need is that nudge to be more attentive and to be more critically engaged when they are in online spaces. So we have some ideas about what works, but we're now operating in this new landscape with generative AI, which is a very exciting and useful new technology, but very, I think, frightening in the context of misinformation and disinformation. One of the big challenges is that generative AI has basically brought the cost of creating disinformation down to zero. So there can be much more disinformation. We're already seeing generative AI in the US political context. There was AI audio of President Biden discouraging voters from turning out in a New Hampshire primary. In Slovakia, there was an audio deep fake circulating of a Slovakian political candidate saying very unsavory things. So we're already seeing these things in the electoral context. We're not yet sure what the consequences will be, but I think the major challenge with generative AI is that it undermines these tools that we have to help people spot misinformation. So all of those things that I told you about before with these tips to look at headlines, look at photos, look at hyperlinks, generative AI can be very effective at creating spoofs of all of these things. And because the cost of creating these posts is almost zero, bad actors can create a bunch of different versions of posts and then kind of see which ones are most effective. So my concern about this is also people knowing that this is out there also exacerbates information uncertainty. And I've seen this in my own research, that we see people really questioning real social media posts, that they don't know whether these posts are true or not because they're operating in this environment where they know that images can be faked. They know that audio and video can be faked. And so they don't really know how to believe what's true and what's not. And this is a huge problem in the US electoral context where we have mistrust in institutions. So whatever the outcome of this election is, as political scientists, we want people to trust the results, to trust the institutions. And in the past, there's been specific misinformation about electoral fraud. There were false narratives from the 2020 election about stuffing ballot boxes. So we really want to avoid this type of mistrust in the institutions around elections. In terms of kind of where to go next with this, I have an ongoing project with Nick Beamster, who is a computer scientist at the University of Chicago, where we're looking at how different platforms moderate AI-generated content. So we're looking at the platforms as kind of the first place where these decisions are being made about what gets promoted and what doesn't get promoted in online spaces. And there are a lot of issues here around trust and transparency. So one of the challenges is that platforms themselves are using AI, are using things like ChatGPT to classify social media posts and then determine what actions to take. So there may not be a human who's actually looking at a post and deciding, is this real, is this not, should this stay on the platform, should this not? And that's a problem with trust and transparency, but how decisions are made. And so the goal here, I would hope, would be that there should be enough trust in platforms to facilitate authentic political participation while removing misleading content and bad actors from these spaces. So Professor Bloch Rubin will talk about some of the different outcomes that we could see as the consequence of voters' choices next month.
Thank you, Molly. I think this is actually a great point to pivot on, which is, right, we're concerned about mistrust, whether that's mistrust in our information environment or the risk of distrusting the electoral outcome or the institutions that are put in place to translate voters' preferences as decided in elections into policymaking. And at the root of sort of distrust in institutions, I think, is a mismatch between our expectations about what we want to happen, what we think institutions can accomplish, and then the reality. And so what I'm going to focus on in talking about Congress, the presidency, and the courts is sort of the disjuncture between the consequence of this election, right? This is a very close, very exciting election, and then sort of the reality of governance and what that's going to look like. So why don't we start first in thinking about the separation of powers with Congress? As I flagged at the beginning of the talk, I think we should expect a form of divided government. And that means in our system of separated powers that it is very likely that the president will be of one party and at least one legislative chamber, either the House or the Senate, will be of another party. So what does this mean for what Congress in particular and our federal government more broadly is going to be able to accomplish? Well, as we know, divided government historically in American politics has often meant that presidential administrations are reasonably ineffective. They are unlikely to be able to pass major legislation. And Congress, because it is not able necessarily to coordinate between the House and the Senate, right? What Senate Democrats and House Republicans or House Democrats and Senate Republicans might want are going to be fairly different, that Congress as a whole is going to be relatively ineffective in passing major pieces of legislation, formulating legislative solutions to the problems that most Americans want Congress to solve. And so then the question is, if lawmakers aren't going to be able to legislate, what are they going to do with their time? And what we know from the past is that typically when you can't legislate, lawmakers investigate. And so during periods of divided government, we see an uptake in investigative hearings of the White House and of bureaucrats in the executive branch. And one sort of downside to this kind of investigatory politics is that it tends to heighten public distrust of the presidency and some discomfort with Congress as a whole, right? Congress isn't busy legislating. Congress is busy picking fights with the White House. And this doesn't tend to lend itself well with sort of public majorities. Another interesting feature about Congress will be that regardless of who wins control of the White House and who has majorities in Congress, those majorities in Congress are likely to be very narrow. This is something that we have today. Republicans in the House have a very, very narrow majority, which, as we've seen, has made it really difficult to govern. In the Senate, majorities are also narrow, and the supermajority requirement imposed by the filibuster means that no party is likely to have the 60 votes that make legislating more straightforward in the Senate. And so here, too, Congress's capacity to do the kind of work that I think Americans reasonably expect of the institution is going to be limited. So lawmakers here, though, if we think narrow majorities are going to be sort of shaping our politics, aren't necessarily going to mean that lawmakers are only engaging in investigations, But what we know is that lawmakers will shy from substantive lawmaking, passing big pieces of legislation like the Affordable Care Act, engaging in kinds of reform that I think most Americans think are important on domestic policy issues as well as foreign policy, but instead will pass messaging bills. These are pieces of legislation that signal what one party cares a lot about, but don't actually move the needle when it comes to substantive changes in the status quo. Now, one thing that I think will be really interesting to watch is to expect variation in how party leaders are performing across chambers. So one of the most interesting things about, I think, our current Congress is that we've seen considerable variation in how legislative leaders have performed. So if you think about American politics and in the House particular, the speakership, you've seen very different speakers over the course of the past 2 decades. You had Nancy Pelosi, who as speaker governed with a great deal of control over the legislative chamber and maintained control over her Democratic majority or the Democratic minority when the Democrats were in the minority for 2 decades. And you've seen a lot more turnover among Republican leaders. And so the question is why? Why do we have more turnover among Republican leaders in Congress than Democrats? And what my own research suggests is that to understand why we get these different leadership dynamics, we have to understand the structure of the 2 parties themselves. Often political scientists think about the Democratic and Republican parties as 2 sides of the same coin. But in reality, when it comes to their organization, the 2 parties are very different. Democrats in Congress have a more equitable organizational dynamic among progressive members and moderate members. And counterintuitively, this makes the party easier to govern because no faction within the party has an advantage over another. And so this allows leaders to navigate between them with relative ease. More challenging circumstances within the Republican Party, where hardline Republicans, most conservative Republicans are quite well organized in groups like the House Freedom Caucus, and moderate Republicans are quite disorganized. And so this means that when Republican leaders are trying to negotiate with their own members, the people they have to listen to are the ones that are best organized. And so that means Republican Party politics is often, if not always, going to skew towards the right. So this makes it really difficult to govern in a system that requires compromise. You can't always be satisfying the extremists and simultaneously compromising with the other party, which is inevitably required when you're operating with narrow majorities or under divided government. And so in short, as consequential as this race will be for control over Congress, I don't think we should be expecting great things from our national legislature. So what can we expect from the presidency? As Molly and I have suggested, I think we don't know who is going to win. The race is too close to call. But there are some generalized lessons that we've learned about how the presidency operates over the past couple of decades that I think can inform our expectations about what is likely to transpire whoever wins. One of the things that I think is clear is that candidates, overpromise what they can accomplish within the White House. They tell us great stories about the policy prescriptions that they plan to implement, the ways they will work with Congress to pass legislative solutions to our problems, and how they're going to engage with foreign actors. The problem is that actually being president in a period of time where Congress may not be amenable or easy to work with, is that you're going to have to do a lot with your own executive branch officials. You're going to have to work with federal agencies. You're going to have to staff that bureaucracy with federal appointees who will listen to you. And that takes time and is difficult to do. And so we should expect that whoever wins is going to be someone who's overpromised, but is going to have a difficult time delivering on many of those promises. And if we think about distrust in the federal government and in the presidency and Congress, this is not a good thing. The greatest, I think, sort of reason why people distrust legitimately our institutions is because political actors promise things that they know they can't deliver. And neither Trump or Harris are neophytes in this way. They know, I think, reasonably what can be accomplished, and they are overpromising for political gain, which is what you do on campaigns, but is not good for the overall mass politics. As I suggested, because Harris or Trump is likely to have to work within the executive branch to get what they want, we're going to see what I think political scientists would describe as a politicization of the bureaucracy. But what this really means is that presidents are going to try and exert greater control over federal agencies and federal bureaucrats, career civil servants, to advance their agenda because they're not going to be able to work productively with Congress to get what they promised to voters. And so we're also likely to see, in addition to sort of greater exercises of control over the federal bureaucracy, a proliferation of executive orders and directives, which are essentially instructions by the president for federal bureaucrats to listen to presidential directions as opposed to legislative prescriptions. And so this creates or increases the odds that there's going to be tension between the president and Congress, because whichever congressional party is in control of a chamber that is hostile to the president, they're going to see this as a threat to their own authority over the federal agencies. And so this is both going to seed investigations, but also politicize career civil servants who don't want to get caught between a frustrated president and a recalcitrant Congress. I think the other thing that's important to appreciate is that over time, there have been windows where, despite how divided the country has been, a president is elected and they're granted a what we call honeymoon period, a short period of time, typically 100 days or so, where everyone is playing nicely and presidents are able to push through at least some of their agenda priorities. But I think polarization and recent history suggests that that honeymoon period is shrinking. And so this is going to compound the existing problems to governing as president, which is that you're afforded a shorter window to try and deliver on some of the promises you made as a candidate. And you are less likely to see a cooperative Congress for the full 100 days. You're more likely to meet resistance immediately. You're also likely to meet resistance from career civil servants who perceive you to be perhaps even a one-term president. And so their incentives to cooperate are going to be more limited. And so while presidents, as a general rule, overpromise and underdeliver, I think that's going to be even more the case today, regardless of who wins. And so I think what the important thing to note here is that this is not a function of personality, presidential personality. This is going to be a function of the institutional structure that the president is going to have to navigate. So regardless of how competent you think Trump or Harris would be, these are going to be the hurdles that they have to face. If we pivot to the courts, I think we see a somewhat more muted effect of the presidential election. So if we can advance the slides, what we see here is that the conservative supermajority on the court is unlikely to change course unless a justice dies on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to be able to proceed as it has, regardless of the election's outcome. And the court will continue to intervene on matters that are deeply substantive and matter a great deal to the American public. We've seen recent decisions that engage with a question about presidential immunity. Those decisions are going to continue to reverberate. We continue to see sort of judicial decisions on women's reproductive rights. Those are continuing to percolate. We're seeing challenges to federal agencies' ability to control industry pollution. Those are issues that the court is likely to continue to consider without implications or without sort of constraint from the outcomes of the presidential election. But what is going to matter a great deal for the courts with this particular election is which party is going to be controlling the Senate, and whether the president, whoever wins, whether their party controls the Senate, because it is through the president's ability to nominate new judges and the Senate's ability to confirm them that new judges are added to the lower courts. And so presidents, in conjunction with a hospitable, friendly Senate, are going to be able to shift the direction of the lower courts as retiring judges leave and new opportunities arise for presidents to stock individuals who are ideologically sympathetic to their party or to their priorities in the lower courts. So we're not likely to see a lot of change at the level of the Supreme Court, but I think it is still quite important, if you care about the court system and the judiciary, to think about who will be controlling the Senate and how well they will work with the president, whoever wins, to stock the lower courts. Now, one question that's been quite interesting of late is whether there is enough public will and legislative interest in reforming the judiciary, and in particular, the Supreme Court. There have been a variety of what I think we could charitably call ethical lapses in the behavior of some of the justices in terms of disclosing donations and trips provided to them by individuals who are then parties to the court. And there has been interest among some Democrats in Congress to pass judicial reforms. But I think given the realities of divided government and narrow majorities, the likelihood of any kind of judicial reform passing Congress is limited. Now, that does not mean that we will not be talking about judicial reform. Should Harris win the White House, I think it is quite likely that there will be another presidential commission, or at least some significant discussion about the possibility of expanding the Supreme Court. This was a recommendation or one possibility raised under the Biden administration. But the likelihood of that translating into a direct effect on the Supreme Court in terms of its makeup is quite low. Reform of any type is going to be difficult to achieve given the discordant branches of government and the fact that both parties are not going to control everything. And as a consequence, legislating or doing much of anything in our system of separated powers when one party does not control everything is quite limited. Okay, so if you take one thing away from my conversation with you about what is likely to happen to our domestic political institutions following the election, the answer should be not much, right? Presidents are going to talk a lot. There's going to be a lot of rhetoric, but the odds that huge transformative policymaking is going to occur quite limited. So where are we likely to see big changes? And here I think we can look to our party system. So what can we learn about this election for how our political parties are functioning and where they are likely to go in the future? So I think if we've learned anything from this election, the reality is that Trumpism, whatever you think that is, whether that's sort of a radical populism, a sort of kind of rhetoric and style to politics, a strategy, a model of how to think about and mobilize grievance, whatever you think Trumpism is, I think it is clear that that has subsumed the Republican Party in really important ways. And so this suggests that Trumpism will outlive Trump, that brand or style of politics and this has really important implications for the health of our democracy. Typically, the Republican Party has been split between conservatives as well as moderates. But here it's becoming more difficult for moderates to exist or coexist within the Republican Party. And so that has really profound implications for leadership in Congress, for collaboration among the branches, and for the health of our democracy. If moderates don't have a voice within the Republican Party, that's not good for our sort of system of representative government. On the Democratic side of the ticket, I think we see more of the same. Selecting Walz as her VP pick, I think suggests that the Democratic Party is continuing to wrestle with just how progressive it can afford to be. And we've seen in recent weeks that Vice President Harris and Tim Walz are moving toward the right in their appeals to voters, which is what political scientists would predict would happen, but hasn't necessarily been the case for a lot of recent races where Democrats have moved away from the center and embraced left-wing politics. But here we see a sort of a return to the median voter theory, where in order to win this election, you need to win over moderate voters, and Harris and Walz are moving in that direction. And I think, again, that this points to the fact that the Democratic Party can't figure out where it wants to be. It continues to have a constituency that wants it to embrace strong progressive causes. And those individuals control a great deal of resources and numbers within the party. But the pivotal people, the individuals at the level of office holders and perhaps among the electorate that are going to ensure that the Democratic Party wins a majority, be it of the Electoral College or in Congress, those individuals are more moderate. And so the party is between a rock and a hard place. It can't decide how progressive it can afford to be to please perhaps a majority of its majority and still win over the people who will make it a majority. They're majority makers. And so this suggests that we're going to see continued strife within the Democratic Party, again, over how liberal or progressive the party itself should be and still be competitive against Republicans.
I think the presentations were absolutely fantastic. And what I'd like to do is let me ask a question first to Molly, then I'll ask a question to Ruth, and then we'll have one I think that would be great to have both of you comment on. So Molly, if I could, one of the things we know, aside from disinformation becoming a bigger issue, is the speed of information itself is growing. The speed itself is growing. And what I wonder is how these two things are going to interact. And let me give you some examples. So, for example, we have the Hunter Biden laptop, which first came out and was supposed to be an X. And then we have now a different view of it as a Y. But we also, just yesterday, and again, this could be, I'm getting disinformation. We know the FBI crime statistics were supposed to show lower levels of violent crime, but then I'm seeing that the FBI has just revised them, just literally, I think yesterday, to show they're actually higher. Now, and again, maybe that's disinformation, but bottom line is, given the speed at which information is coming in and changing, is it really possible to develop interventions that don't have a political bias? Is that possible?
Is it possible to develop interventions that don't have a political bias? Can you just say
Given the speed of information that's coming in, you see, so what I'm saying is we have disinformation, but we also have the speed of new information coming in. And so is it possible to develop interventions that limit disinformation without ultimately having some kind of political bias?
Interesting. So I think one of the challenges that you're bringing up here is just the complex information environments that people are existing in. And I think it's very challenging for us as political scientists, but also for other people who follow the news and political events, political pundits, et cetera, to try and interpret very quickly changing media cycles to update based on these events. And I think for regular voters who maybe follow the news, but not so closely, it can be completely overwhelming. And so I think it is really, really challenging for people to navigate these information environments, try and figure out what matters, what's true, what's not. I think one of the things we can try and help people do is to develop good heuristics, because basically what people have to do is they're not able to process all of this information. They're not able to evaluate every new piece of information as it comes in. And so they need to rely on some sort of heuristic for what they should trust, what they should not trust, to how they can understand the state of the world. And with fewer kind of more centralized news sources, that previously was an approach that people could take, but now when news sources are so fragmented, having good heuristics for what to believe, I think is really challenging. And I think we saw a phenomenon similar to this with the COVID-19 pandemic, where scientists were kind of understanding how the virus was transmitted, what precautions people should take, what was effective, what was not effective. At first, they thought that it could be transmitted by surfaces, and so we should really worry about surfaces a lot. Then the science kind of updated that. And so for people to kind of make good decisions while following along with the scientific process that was constantly being updated was a really challenging policy moment. And I think that the CDC and federal and state governments had a really challenging time figuring out how to communicate people how they should make choices. So I'm giving like not a real answer to you, but I think that the answer is that any type of intervention is going to have to be aimed at giving people good heuristics. We can't give people new information all the time as one unified source. We have to help people figure out how to navigate these environments.
Great, great. Well, and by the way, there may not be clear answers here, but that doesn't mean it's not to wrestle with. Ruth, let me ask you a question here. So you've got really quite clear that you're expecting a divided government. But let me ask you about what that might mean for our international audience and the following way. Historically, I think we're used to thinking that if Congress is divided and the president can't get through the domestic agenda that he or now she might want to get through, that would encourage a foreign policy tilt for that president. However, you're describing a somewhat different situation where you're describing that because of the divided government, this is going to lead to greater emphasis by the president to get a grip on and actually control and steer the administrative bureaucracy. And you're also describing this is really going to take effort. So what I'm wondering here, and I think this would be really helpful for our international audience, is are you what are you thinking? Are you thinking that in fact, even though historically divided government has really tended to mean less domestic, more foreign policy attention, are you thinking that in fact this next president might well actually be very consumed with domestic issues?
I think part of the challenge is extrapolating from history, because in prior periods, foreign policy was a less polarized terrain than domestic politics. And so when a president under divided government couldn't accomplish what they wanted within domestic politics, as you say, they would pivot to foreign policy where they might get more agreement from the opposing party. The challenge, as we've seen, is that many aspects of American foreign policy are now as polarized as our domestic politics. And we saw that with, say, votes on Ukraine aid, and thinking about the politics of Israel, and thinking about tariff policy, right? This is also about international political economy. This has been integrated into our domestic politics, and we've seen that in the campaign. And so I think it will be challenging for presidents to find those areas as places where there will be more cooperation with Congress than on domestic politics. I think those are likely to be as challenging. And so we should imagine that presidents will use the same toolkit that they use when politics is difficult on the domestic side. They turn inward and try and use the executive branch. I would imagine that we will see a similar move made on matters of foreign policy that are quite important to whichever president wins. So using the federal bureaucracy where possible to intervene in foreign affairs or to shape foreign policy when Congress won't cooperate. And so here I think one interesting thing is that in American politics, we would imagine that the delta between our politics of domestic policy and our politics of foreign policy is going to shrink. They're going to look a lot more similar than they were in prior eras, where there were these very distinct sort of faces of power or modes of engagement.
That's really helpful. That really helps. I hope, because we have several questions coming in the chat, I think, that are more specific but still related. Let me ask a more general question to both of you, which is, in just less than 3 weeks, somebody will at least initially win, and then there will also be an initial loser. And I'm really wondering about this from the perspective of the losers here, and understanding that that could actually change over time. But let's just call it the initial loser anyway. And what I'm wondering is whether for the losers, this means that losers will be in particular likely to glom on to disinformation. So separate from AI, separate from algorithms, separate from everything else that we're talking about, will there be simply incentives here to really push, grab, spread disinformation for the losers that are about to really kick in? And then I'm also wondering on the side of losers for say, Congress and the parties, which is, and especially, I think the way you describe the Democratic Party is going through this kind of internal debate. Ruth, what I'm wondering is, would losing, especially for the Democratic Party, mean basically internal squabbles so much that even the idea of like investigations or so, the kind of thing you're describing, how much will the losing actually become the issue for the losing party? So what does this mean for the losers, as I said, essentially what I'm asking?
So on the information side, I think the short answer is Yes. The losing side is, I think, more likely to believe disinformation that's consistent with a narrative that's palatable to them. So we know that people are more likely to believe information and disinformation that is consistent with their worldview and their political perspectives. From a wide array of studies, people are just more likely to believe pieces of information that describe a version of the world that they like, that is consistent with their political party being in the right, that is consistent with the political actors that they like having been more effective. And so I think for whoever wins and whoever is the initial loser, as you said, I do think that the supporters of that candidate are going to believe narratives that are more flattering or more consistent to their worldview. I do think that the specific narratives will be very different for the two parties, in that I think for Republicans, pushing back on the institutional infrastructure might be a narrative that would be more likely to fly. For Democrats, I think they might talk about how information or misinformation has affected people. I think we'll kind of see what happens as the results come in. I think we'll be seeing a lot of different narratives. And as you asked in the last question, Bob, I think we'll also be operating in a situation where we'll be getting a lot of information in quickly, right? The results will be being updated. We'll have to update our updates. And I think it'll be very challenging for people to kind of process that. And so on both sides, I think people will glom onto narratives that are easier to understand and consistent with what they already expect is going to happen. In terms of the consequences, Ruth, maybe you have more insights.
Well, I just wanted to first just agree, I think, with what Molly has said here, and to underscore that, one of the challenges we have is that if there's uncertainty after the election, it's not obvious what an office holder, what a presidential candidate should do in that context. I think what we've seen is that the Republicans have learned useful lessons about the sort of plausibility of maintaining election outcome denial stories that has not been punished at the polls, it would so seem. And for Democrats, I think the history lesson that they're going to draw from are the Bush-Gore decisions, where Gore essentially ceded ground for some Democrats too soon and left it to the courts to decide. And given that there is a supermajority on the court that is quite conservative today, I think that is going to be less palatable for Democrats. And so for a Democratic candidate and for the Democratic Party to represent Democratic voters, it's not obvious that one should immediately cede or assume that the outcome is the outcome until all of the votes are counted. And so that creates, I think, a challenging dynamic, because there are representational reasons why both parties might want to play a wait and see approach. But that gives room, as Molly's suggesting, for all of this disinformation to come in and for people to get further entrenched that their position is right, that their candidate did in fact win, when that period of time, that sort of breathing room, is actually just about getting to the right answer. But in that moment in time, people are going to become more sure that they're going to get the answer they want, which leads to the kinds of things, Bob, you study, which is sort of the political violence that comes after all of this, right? Which everyone is more certain that they're correct. I think in terms of, what we should expect to see as the consequences of this is just that, to the extent that we're worried, America's political system is tolerant of polarization, but requires compromise for the institutions to operate. And so to the extent that we see this sort of very close election where it's not obvious that the loser is going to go home at the end of the day, it makes compromise more difficult, because in order to compromise, you need to essentially say, I lost this round, but now I'm ready to work with you and get some other win. And if people haven't made that first concession, that's a problem. In terms of the Democratic Party per se, if Democrats lose, if Harris loses, the reality is I think there would be Democratic squabbling one way or the other. But no one is going to have a lot of data or the data is going to be inconclusive about whether, had Harris only been more progressive, would she have won? If Harris had been more moderate, would she have won? The election is so close, I don't think we're going to get definite answers. And that's been a problem in past elections and just perpetuates this consistent cycle of arguing between Democrats, progressive and moderate candidates, and office holders. And so I think that's just going to be a problem. In terms of unifying the party, nothing has unified Democrats so well as opposition to Donald Trump. And so if we're Donald Trump to become president, I think you could reasonably expect that Democrats in Congress will get their act together. They'll put their differences aside and work together as a minority or majority party to oppose the president. That's one of the things we've learned from divided government, that even remarkably chaotic parties can come together to oppose a president they don't like.
So that's great, and we're getting a whole lot of questions coming in, and let me try to unify some of the questions, and just to let you both know, there's a number of people who are writing in who essentially want responsible leadership to continue in the United States. They may not know what that is, but they also would identify that others with centrist policies or working together policies. So just so you know, there's a lot of people who essentially are voting for that if they could get it in the United States. But let me see if I can try to take those hankerings here and then stitch them together to an issue. And let's just, for the moment, bracket the issue of potential violence in the next few months. And let's look at a little more long-term, hopefully, which is, so one of the issues that Molly you brought up is the whole issue of disinformation and the need to sort of get a grip on it. And then, Ruth, of course, you're studying Congress, and as you know, getting a grip on the tech companies has been a huge issue inside of Congress. So could you just both talk about, and others have asked in the chat also, you should know, they want to hear more about like the financial incentives, Molly, about the algorithm and so forth here. But let me just ask a sort of a specific question, which may be a little too specific, but could we ever imagine a world after this election where there's actually tax policies on the algorithm that tax tech companies for bad uses of the algorithm and reward them for good uses of the algorithm that could actually get through Congress? I mean, is that something, or are we in such a prisoner's dilemma-like world that there's just no way to do that? But let me just kind of ask it that specific way.
Oh, that's so interesting. In terms of the political feasibility of that as a policy solution, yeah, I'm not sure, but I do think this question of who should be regulating and who should be making these decisions is a very sticky one. I'll talk about Facebook as that's the tech platform that I have the most insight on. It is possible that there is some more engagement with disinformation. And there have been some research studies showing that people share disinformation more than true information, but I think that's very context specific. It's possible that some of these platforms are benefiting from the spread of misinformation and disinformation and people's engagement with it, but Facebook in particular does not want to be politicized. Facebook does not want to be a driver of political polarization. They do not want to be seen as a source of misinformation and disinformation. They really want to distance themselves from being politically interpreted in this way. So there may be some financial incentives from this content existing on these platforms, but I think many of the platforms really are driven and motivated to not be seen as drivers of political polarization and potentially political unrest in the US. So platforms do want to see these changes. It is challenging for them to figure out how to regulate the content that exists on the platforms in ways that are fair and transparent. So there is a tension here in terms of content moderation, that you want to make rules that are interpretable to people. So if people post content that gets taken down, they know why it's taken down, they understand what that rule is, and they know how to navigate that. Whether they think that those rules are fair or not, transparency is a really important part of trust in platforms, that you know what the rules are, you know how to navigate them. And different platforms have taken different models of this, right? Reddit has subreddits that have specific rules, and they have users who are moderators who make these decisions, but many of the platforms are kind of top down and they're making these decisions. So platforms are trying to make these decisions. It's not clear that they are the best positioned to make responsible decisions about what content should be able to be disseminated. I do think one of the challenges with algorithms is that these platforms are using algorithm to decide what gets shown on your news feed. But even a temporal presentation of social media posts is algorithmic. It's just like some decision about what content to show. So there's no a algorithmic solution, right? We have to use an algorithm. We have to make some type of decisions about what content gets shown in what order, what stays on the platform, what doesn't stay on the platform. And so the really challenging decision is the algorithm transparent? And what are the outcomes that we want to see? What are we trying to optimize for? And so there was one of the questions that was submitted about kind of the tension between free speech, which is regulated by the government, and what should get to exist on the platforms. And so the platforms aren't responsible for protecting free speech, but there is some type of, I think, inherent objective that we believe in, that people should be able to express themselves on platforms and communicate, share their political perspectives. In terms of what the role of the government will be in regulating this is a very open conversation. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that our policymakers are not sufficiently technologically savvy right now to be able to make informed, responsible decisions. Our tech platforms are technologically savvy to a large extent, but are not correctly incentivized and don't necessarily have the right authority to responsibly make those decisions. And so figuring out the kind of like the right conversation to have between these two entities is going to be ongoing, an interesting space to watch. I think research like what I'm proposing with Nick Feemster, where we have research on contents moderation policies, and one of our proposals is to create a kind of website or repository of the different policies that platforms have, where people can contribute to this and discuss some of the consequences of some of these policies, and the implementation of these policies will improve transparency, so we can at least better understand what the impacts of content moderation is. But it's a very open question as we kind of go into this brave new world of AI generated content.
I think if we think about like what is Congress's incentives or capacity to engage in any kind of regulation of these platforms, I think there's two things to pay attention to. One, many of the office holders who are now in a position to police were elected with the aid of these programs. So they've adapted their offices and their PR strategies and their communications to these platforms. And so they are comfortable with this world. And so their incentive to alter that, to sort of rein it in, are more limited because they've been the ones that have benefited from it. The people who have lost elections because of this are now not in a position to legislate. They're no longer in Congress. And so one would worry that sort of the incentive structure is not favorable. But even if you put that aside, I think, there are places where lawmakers have suggested that they are interested in regulating what tech companies are doing. This is often, as it touches on children and sort of mental health and things like this, right? So there are areas where it's more obvious where you could get congressional consensus across the two parties. There we see sort of a capacity problem, as Molly's suggesting, which is that lawmakers are not tech savvy. And when they're looking to acquire expertise, they're often relying on information from tech companies themselves about how those algorithms and platforms operate. And so there's an asymmetry in information that makes it difficult to regulate these entities, because the entities are going to be the ones who are in a position to provide information about how they should be regulated. And so the odds of any regulations actually being effective, even if Congress were able to get its act together to do something about it, I think are reasonably limited at this moment in time. That's not to say that over time Congress won't acquire sufficient expertise, but as of now, I think the odds of them reining this in are quite low.
Yeah, Ruth, I used to think when I gave talks, I depressed people, but I got to tell you that your rival. I want to, I think probably given our time, yeah, 5 minutes left. We're going to make this our last question. And there's a number of questions here, and this is going to lead to a broad question that's not really directly at all about your research, but I do think it would be very helpful here. So a number of folks in the chat are really thinking that this is sort of bad news for democracy around the world, that American democracy is having trouble, and this is causing a loss of credibility for democracy around the world. Now, I know you don't study democracy around the world, however, but I do think it would be helpful for the folks to know just how worried are each of you about our, quote, democracy. And I don't mean that you have studied, you're not political theorists, so we all understand that. But I do think it would just be helpful if you could just give us your basic temperature on where you're at with the general concern about our democracy.
I'm extremely worried in the context of misinformation and disinformation too. I think that we can have interventions that can help people to navigate these spaces, but I increasingly think that misinformation and disinformation are going to be just rampant in our information environments. And that's just something that we will exist in going forward.
I think here, the thing I think a lot about is that the pathologies of American democracy per se, or the structure of our system of government with its separated powers and federal system, means that most of the time we're whining about American democracy because it can't keep up with what voters want and what office holders want. It's very slow moving. There's a lot of inertia, and that's generally a bad thing. We want our institutions to be responsive. Here, maybe we're going to get to see what happens, or why that's sometimes salutary, that having institutions that are slow to adapt, that don't play nicely with each other, may actually sow sufficient divisions within whichever party gains the White House or Congress, such that we're able to slow roll things enough that American democracy is able to sort of stabilize and everyone comes to their senses. I think at the end of the day, we have over the course of American history weathered a lot of challenges. And I think there's nothing per se to suggest that we can't do so again. We survived a civil war. And so, that may be coming, but we made it through one. Perhaps that suggests we should make it through another. I think the thing that I worry about is just, our tolerance for the kinds of things, Bob, that you study, political violence, that violence in our lives has just become something that many people seem willing to live with when it comes to our educational environment, for example. And so, our ability to look at our politics and say, this doesn't seem right, we should expect better. If our standards are so low, that's a problem. But I think that's a global problem with what citizens of the world expect from their governments. If we don't expect a lot, we're not going to get a lot. And so I think the key for Americans, and I think for anyone who's watching American politics, is to expect American institutions to do better. And it's only when we expect them to and sort of demand that, that we'll get action. Otherwise, stasis is the word of the day.
So that actually, just so you know, fits a little bit with the message I gave, which is, yes, expect quite intense turmoil, even violent turmoil, but ultimately I'm expecting a relatively soft landing. It just may take a few years. And that's sort of where you came out. And I'm glad we ended on a more optimistic note here, but not a unified optimistic note. So I think we have to turn it back over to Mark and just for him to thank everybody.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for your leadership on this program, and Ruth and Molly, who I think we lost temporarily there. But the good news is, Bob, the last question you asked feeds really nicely into our next program, which is the next episode of the U.S. presidential election series, which is called The Resilience of American Democracy. So I think we're going to take that last question and Ruth's response, and we'll give Molly another chance to kind of take a shot at answering that question about American democracy and how resilient it is. That will actually take place on December 5th, that episode. So it'll be well after the election has taken place. Hopefully we'll have, announced a winner of the election by that point. The program will be on December 5th at 8:30 p.m. Hong Kong time. That's a Thursday night. So that'll be 1 month after the presidential election. All 5 of our faculty from each of the previous episodes will be joining us to come together to talk about the results of the election, the immediate aftermath, and where things may be headed after the election. We'll also be having another episode, which we've added on in January. We haven't announced it yet, but we will do so by the December 5th program. So I encourage you all to attend that program. On a lighter note, just before the election and slightly before Halloween, on October 30th at 8 p.m., we have another program which we're calling Tailor Made: How One American Artist is Shaping Global Culture, Economics, and Politics. And guess who that's about? Our UChicago Taylor Swift scholar, Professor Paula Harper, will discuss Taylor Swift's impact on the world. Bob, you're welcome to join that one as well, but I think we're going to have it be a little bit lighter in anticipation leading up to the election. So, you know, I'm not a Swiftie. I learned from Paula the other day that I'm not a Swiftie. She pointed that out clearly. But if you're a Swiftie or not, please come and join us for the program to talk about, and we will be addressing Taylor Swift's political stance and how that may affect the election. So it'll be a nice program leading up to the election on November 5th. Last but not least, we have a new heritage exhibition, Refugee and Renaissance Man, Solomon Bard, 1916 to 2014, and his 60 years in Hong Kong. That one's open now and available to visit January 2nd through January 2nd of 2025. I've got a lot of other programs coming up the rest of this year and into next year that we're in the planning stages of. I hope to see you all again in the coming weeks. Again, thanks to all of our great UChicago faculty and Bob's leadership on this series. Have a great evening or a great morning to all of our friends in Chicago.
And thank you, Mark, and the Hong Kong Center. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a great night.